In the windswept wilderness of 1887, when Wyoming Territory was still more promise than progress, and winter claimed more dreams than gold fever, desperate people made desperate choices. Levi Shaw stood in the doorway of Henderson's trading post, reading a newspaper advertisement that would change everything. Traveling preacher seeks to unite God-fearing souls in holy matrimony. Good Christian girls seeking stable homes and providers. At 42, with calloused hands and a heart scarred by loss, Levi had nothing left but his failing ranch and fading hope. What he didn't expect was Etta Mae, 17, fierce, and running from a past that had already tried to break her. Within 1 hour of meeting, they would stand before a dying preacher in an abandoned chapel, speaking vows that felt more like a business transaction than a sacred promise. But sometimes the most unlikely partnerships bloom in the harshest soil. What happens when survival becomes the foundation for something deeper? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The newspaper crinkled between Levi Shaw's weathered fingers as he read the advertisement for the third time that morning. The wind howled through the gaps in Henderson's trading post walls, carrying with it the bite of early autumn and the promise of another brutal Wyoming winter. Outside, the endless expanse of prairie grass bent low under grey skies, a landscape that had once seemed full of possibility, but now felt like a prison of his own making. Levi folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of his worn flannel shirt, feeling the weight of the decision settling in his chest like a stone. The advertisement had appeared in the Territorial Tribune 3 days running, and each time he'd seen it, something inside him had stirred. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Something that felt dangerously like desperation dressed up in Sunday clothes. "You gonna buy something, Shaw, or just stand there letting my heat out?" Old Henderson's voice carried the particular irritation of a man who'd been watching customers loiter without purchasing for the better part of 40 years. Levi nodded toward the shelves. "Need some flour and salt. Maybe some coffee if you've got any that doesn't taste like it's been sitting since statehood." Henderson snorted. "Statehood's still a ways off, and you know it. Territory coffee's all I got, and it's better than no coffee at all." He shuffled behind the counter, his arthritic hands moving with practiced efficiency despite their obvious pain. "That newspaper keeping you up nights? Seen you reading it every day this week." "Just catching up on the news." Levi examined a sack of beans with more attention than it deserved, avoiding Henderson's knowing look. The old storekeeper had a way of seeing through a man's defenses that made conversation uncomfortable. "News." Henderson measured out the flour with careful precision. "That what we're calling marriage advertisements these days?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Levi set down the beans and met Henderson's eyes directly. There was no judgment there, just the patient observation of a man who'd seen every kind of human desperation the frontier had to offer. "Sarah's been gone 3 years come December," Levi said quietly. "Ranch is falling apart. Can't afford to. I hire help and I'm not getting any younger." That's practical thinking. Henderson wrapped the purchases in brown paper with movements that had become ritual over decades of commerce. "Practical's served many a man well out here. Question is, whether practical's enough to build a life on." Levi thought about his empty cabin, about the silence that had become his constant companion since the fever took Sarah. He thought about the cattle he'd had to sell off one by one as the ranch debts mounted, about the fences that needed mending, and the roof that leaked when the wind blew from the northwest. He thought about the tobacco tin hidden beneath his mattress, the one that held the thin gold band Sarah had worn for 8 years of marriage. "Practical's all I've got left," he admitted. Henderson nodded slowly. "Practical's got its place. But you remember what you told me when you first brought Sarah around? Said she made you feel like the man you'd always wanted to be. That wasn't Practical talking. The memory hit Levi like a physical blow. Sarah, 19 and bright-eyed, stepping down from the stagecoach with her carpetbag and her Eastern manners, looking around the rough frontier town like she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for. She'd been running from something too, an arranged marriage back in Pennsylvania that her father had planned to settle his gambling debts. But she'd been running toward something as well, toward a life where she could choose her own path. Sarah was different, Levi said. She chose to come here, chose to marry me because she wanted to, not because she had to. And you think this girl in the advertisement doesn't want to choose? You think she's not looking for something better than whatever she's running from? Levi picked up his packages, the weight of them heavier than it should have been. I think she's 17 years old and probably scared out of her mind. I think I'm a 42-year-old widower who doesn't know how to talk to a woman anymore, let alone a girl young enough to be my daughter. Age difference didn't seem to bother you, and Sarah none. Sarah was different, Levi repeated, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Henderson came around the counter, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had been protesting the cold for longer than he cared to admit. Let me tell you something, Shaw. I've been in this business long enough to see all kinds of desperate folks come through that door, some desperate for food, some for shelter, some for company, and I've learned that desperate doesn't mean hopeless, and it doesn't mean worthless either. The older man walked to the window and looked out at the grey afternoon, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. My Martha answered an advertisement much like that one 43 years ago. Came out here to marry a man she'd never met because her other choice was a workhouse in Boston, scared as a cornered rabbit when she stepped off that stage. Levi had known Martha Henderson for nearly 15 years, had watched her run the trading post with iron efficiency and gentle humor. The idea of her as a frightened young woman seemed impossible. What I'm saying is, Henderson continued, sometimes the best things in life start with the worst circumstances. Sometimes two people who've got nothing left can find something together that they never would have found on their own. Levi shifted the packages under his arm, feeling the newspaper in his pocket like a brand against his chest. What if I can't be what she needs? What if I'm just taking advantage of someone who doesn't have any other choice? Then you make sure she does have choices. You treat her like a partner, not like property. You give her reasons to stay that don't have anything to do with desperation. Henderson turned back to face him. And you remember that marriage isn't just about what you can take from someone. It's about what you can give them too. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the dusty main street. Levi watched a mother hurry past with two small children pulling their coats tight against the cold. The sight stirred something in him, a longing so sharp it was almost physical pain. He'd wanted children with Sarah. They'd talked about it during those long winter nights, planning the nursery they'd add to the cabin, choosing names for sons and daughters who had never come. When the fever took her, it had taken those dreams as well, leaving him with nothing but an empty house and the echo of conversations that would never be. The preacher's supposed to be in Millfield next week, Levi said quietly. According to the advertisement, Henderson nodded. Millfield's a hard 2-day ride from here, longer if the weather turns. I know. You thinking of making that ride? Levi looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of 20 years working cattle and trying to coax a living from unforgiving land. They were honest hands, strong hands, but they were the hands of a man who'd been alone too long. I'm thinking about it. Well, Henderson said, returning to his place behind the counter, thinking's the first step, acting's the second, and living with the consequences is the third. Make sure you're ready for all three. Levi pushed through the door, the bell above, it chiming his departure. The cold hit him immediately, cutting through his clothes and reminding him of the long winter ahead. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, waited patiently at the hitching post, ears pricked forward in greeting. As he secured his purchases in the saddlebags, Levi let his mind wander to the cabin that waited for him. It sat on a small rise, about 5 miles out of town, overlooking a valley that had once grazed 200 head of cattle, but now held maybe 30. The mortgage was 3 months behind, and the bank in Cheyenne was starting to send letters that grew more insistent with each passing week. The house itself was solid enough. He'd built it with his own hands when he'd first claimed the land, using timber hauled down from the mountains and stones pulled from the creek bed. 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, with a wide front porch that caught the morning sun. Sarah had loved that porch, had spent countless hours there with her sewing or her books, watching the seasons change across the valley. Now it stood empty except for the memories that seemed to haunt every corner. Her dresses still hung in the wardrobe upstairs, her books still lined the shelf beside the fireplace, even her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table, washed and waiting for a morning that would never come. The ride home took him through country he knew as well as his own heartbeat. Rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, cut through by streams that ran clear and cold from the mountain's snowpack. It was beautiful land, good land, but it was also hard land that demanded everything a man had to give and sometimes took more than that. He'd come here as a young man full of dreams and determination, convinced that hard work and honest intentions were enough to build a life on. Sarah had believed in those dreams too, had thrown herself into the work of making a home in the wilderness with the same fierce determination that had brought her west in the first place. Together, they'd built something worth having. Not just the ranch, but a partnership that had sustained them through drought and blizzard, through the loneliness that could drive settlers mad, and the constant struggle to wring a living from the land. They'd been a team in the truest sense, each of them stronger for having the other. When she died, that partnership had died with her. Levi had tried to continue alone, but everything seemed harder without her steady presence beside him. Decisions that had once been easy became overwhelming. Work that had once been satisfying became just another burden to bear. Now, 3 years later, he could see the results of that slow decline everywhere he looked. Fences that needed repair, buildings that needed maintenance, cattle that needed better care than one man could provide. The ranch that had once been his pride was becoming his shame, a daily reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he was failing to preserve. The advertisement in his pocket represented a chance to change that trajectory. Not a return to what he'd had with Sarah, that was impossible, but perhaps a step towards something different, something that might grow into partnership again, given time and patience and mutual respect. As he crested the hill that overlooked his valley, Levi pulled Buck to a halt and sat for a moment, taking in the view. The cabin looked small and lonely in the gathering dusk, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving for town. The barn where he kept his few remaining cattle stood open to the wind, one of its doors hanging crooked. On damaged hinges, it wasn't much to offer a wife, especially a young woman who might have dreams of her own. But it was honest work and clean living, and it was his. If she could find something worth building on in this hard country, then maybe they could find something worth building together. The decision crystallized in that moment, as clear and sharp as the mountain air. He would make the ride to Millfield. He would meet whatever young woman had answered that preacher's call, and he would see if 2 desperate people might find something like hope in each other's company. The wind picked up again as he urged Buck down the hill toward home, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of snow. Winter was coming, as it always did, but for the first time in 3 years, Levi Shaw wasn't facing it entirely alone. He journeyed to Millfield, took Levi through country that grew progressively more desolate as he rode east. What little civilization Wyoming Territory possessed seemed to thin out with each mile, until he was traveling through land that looked much as it had when the first trappers had crossed it decades earlier. Rolling prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional creek bottom lined with cottonwoods or a distant mesa rising like a monument from the grassland. He'd packed light for the 2-day journey: bedroll, coffee, hardtack, and jerky enough to last him through the return trip if necessary. Buck carried the load easily, his steady gait eating up the miles with the patience of a horse accustomed to long distances. They'd made this kind of journey before, back when Levi had driven cattle to the railhead in Cheyenne, though never for a purpose quite like this one. The first night he camped beside a creek whose name he didn't know, building a small fire from driftwood and watching the stars emerge in the clear sky above. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on him like a physical presence. In that silence, his doubts grew larger and more insistent. What kind of man answered an advertisement for a wife? What kind of woman placed herself at the mercy of strangers through such an arrangement? The more he thought about it, the more the whole enterprise seemed like madness. Two desperate people making a bargain that neither of them truly understood. But as he rolled himself in his blankets and listened to Buck cropping grass nearby, Levi reminded himself that desperation had driven people to stranger things than marriage. And sometimes those strange things worked out better than anyone had a right to expect. He reached Millfield late on the second day, as the sun was setting behind him and painting the small settlement in shades of gold and red. The town was barely more than a wide spot in the trail: a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along what optimistically called itself Main Street. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were noticed immediately. The meeting was set for 9 o'clock the following morning at the abandoned Methodist church on the town's eastern edge. Levi found the building easily enough. A small wooden structure with a bell tower that had never held a bell and windows that had long since lost their glass. Weeds grew up through the floorboards and swallows nested in the rafters, but the basic structure remained sound. Reverend Crenshaw was already there when Levi arrived, a thin man in his 60s whose consumptive cough echoed in the empty space. Like gunshots, his black suit had seen better days, and his hands shook slightly as he arranged a worn Bible on what had once been the pulpit. "Mr. Shaw, I presume," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an Eastern education. "Thank you for making the journey. I trust the roads treated you kindly." Levi removed his hat and nodded. "Reverend, the young lady, is she here yet?" "She is indeed. Arrived yesterday evening, in fact." Crenshaw's expression grew thoughtful. "A spirited girl, Mr. Shaw. I feel it only fair to warn you that she may not be quite what you're expecting." Before Levi could ask what that meant, he heard footsteps on the wooden steps outside. A moment later, a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning sun. For a heartbeat, Levi couldn't make out any details beyond the general shape of a woman in a traveling dress. Then she stepped into the dim interior of the church, and he got his first clear look at Etta Mae Whitmore. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her dress was serviceable brown wool, mended in several places but clean and properly fitted. She carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd learned early that showing weakness was an invitation for others to take advantage. But it was her expression that caught Levi's attention and held it. This was not the face of a frightened girl grateful for rescue. This was the face of someone who'd been backed into a corner and was prepared to fight her way out if necessary. Her dark eyes moved from Levi to the Reverend and back again with the calculating assessment of a poker player sizing up the opposition. "Miss Whitmore," Reverend Crenshaw said, "may I present Mr. Levi Shaw? Mr. Shaw, Miss Etta Mae Whitmore." Levi stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Whitmore, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." She looked him up and down with frank appraisal, taking in his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the calluses on his hands, the careful way he held himself. "Mr. Shaw," she said finally, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of origins far from Wyoming Territory. "I suppose you are." An uncomfortable silence settled over the three of them. Reverend Crenshaw cleared his throat and gestured toward the wooden benches that still faced the empty pulpit. "Perhaps we should sit and discuss the arrangements." They arranged themselves awkwardly on the hard wooden seats, Levi and Etta Mae, on opposite ends of the front pew, the Reverend facing them from behind his makeshift pulpit. The morning sun streamed through the empty window frames, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. "Now then," Crenshaw began, "I believe you're both here for the same purpose. Mr. Shaw, you're seeking a wife to help you manage your ranch. Miss Whitmore, you're seeking a husband who can provide security and a stable home. Is that correct?" Levi nodded. Etta Mae's expression didn't change, but she inclined her head slightly. "Good. Before we proceed, I think it's important that you both understand what you're agreeing to. This is not a romantic match. This is a practical arrangement between two adults who believe they can benefit from a partnership. Is that your understanding, Mr. Shaw?" "It is," Levi said. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes," she said quietly. Crenshaw consulted a notebook that he pulled from his coat pocket. "Mr. Shaw, Miss Whitmore has some questions for you, as I'm sure you have for her. Miss Whitmore, would you like to begin?" She turned to face Levi directly for the first time since entering the church. "How did your first wife die?" The bluntness of the question caught him off guard. Most people approached the subject of Sarah's death with careful euphemisms, as if speaking plainly about it might somehow make it more real. "Fever," he said. 3 years ago this December. She was sick for about a week, and then she was gone. Do you drink?" "Some. Not to excess." "Do you beat women?" "No. Ever. Never." She nodded, as if his answers confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Your ranch. How much land?" 600 acres, about half of it good grazing land." "How many?" "Cattle? 30 head now. Used to be more. What happened to the rest?" "Sold them to pay debts." "How much debt are you carrying?" Levi felt heat rise in his cheeks. The question was fair, but it cut close to the bone. "Enough that I need to find a way to make the ranch profitable again, or I'll lose it. And you think a wife will solve that problem?" "I think a partner might. Someone to help with the work, to make decisions with. The ranch is too much for one person to manage alone." She was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "What would you expect from me?" "I'd expect you to pull your weight, help with the cooking and cleaning, the garden, tending the chickens if we can afford to keep any, maybe help with the cattle, when needed. And in return, you'd have a home, food, shelter, clothing as needed. Respect." He paused, then added, "and protection." Something flickered in her eyes at that last word. Protection from what? From whatever you're running from. The silence that followed was so complete that Levi could hear his own heartbeat. Etta Mae's hands, which had been folded in her lap, clenched into fists. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" she asked finally. "Because nobody answers an advertisement like this unless they've got nowhere else to go." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fair enough. Yes, Mr. Shaw. I'm running from something. Several somethings, actually. But that's my business. Not yours. It would be my business if we were married. Would it? Or would it just be something you'd use against me when it suited you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Levi looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the defensive posture to the fear underneath. She was scared, he realized. Scared and alone, and trying desperately not to show it. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "I don't know what you've been through, and I won't ask unless you want to tell me. But I can promise you this. If you marry me, your past stays your past, unless it threatens our future. And if something from your past does threaten us, we'll face it together." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back before they could fall. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" "Because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters," he said, "and I know what it's like to be alone." Reverend Crenshaw cleared his throat again. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we should discuss the practical arrangements. Mr. Shaw, Are you prepared to marry Miss Whitmore today, if she's willing? Levi looked at Etta Mae, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a solution to his problems, but as a person with problems of her own. A person who needed help as much as he did, in her own way. Yes, he said, if she'll have me. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. All right, Mr. Shaw, let's make this bargain. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the empty window frames and sending a tumbleweed skittering across the abandoned churchyard. Inside, 3 people prepared to change their lives forever with nothing but hope and desperation to guide them. The wedding ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. Reverend Crenshaw stood behind the broken pulpit with his worn Bible open to a page he seemed to know by heart, his voice echoing in the empty church as he spoke. The ancient words that would bind 2 strangers together in the eyes of God and the law. Levi found himself staring at the silent bell tower above them, at the empty space where a bell should have hung to announce joyous occasions to the surrounding countryside. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Here they were, speaking sacred vows in a place where even the church bell had given up hope. Do you, Levi Shaw, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. The words came out rougher than he'd intended, scraping against his throat like sandpaper. Beside him, Etta Mae stood perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. Do you, Etta Mae Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? A long pause, long enough for Levi to wonder if she was going to change her mind, if she was going to turn and run back out into the prairie rather than bind herself to a stranger. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I do. Reverend Crenshaw closed the Bible with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the abandoned church like a gunshot. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He looked at them both with eyes that held equal measures of hope and concern. You may kiss the bride, Mr. Shaw. Levi turned to face his new wife, seeing the tension in every line of her small frame. She looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, and he saw fear there, and determination, and something that might have been resignation. This was not how either of them had imagined their wedding day, if they'd ever imagined such a day at all. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't move, didn't close her eyes, just watched him with that steady, wary gaze. When his lips touched hers, it was brief and chaste, more a formality than an expression of affection. Her lips were soft but unresponsive, and when he pulled her back, she immediately looked away. Well then, Reverend Crenshaw said, his voice overly bright in the awkward silence that followed. That's done. Mrs. Shaw, Mr. Shaw, may God bless your union and grant you many years of happiness together. Mrs. Shaw. The name sounded strange in the empty church, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Etta Mae. He supposed he should. Think of her as Etta Mae Shaw now. Stood perfectly still for a moment, as if testing the weight of her new identity. There's just the matter of the certificate, Crenshaw continued, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. If you could, both sign here, we'll make it official in the eyes of the law as well as the Lord. They signed their names in the spaces indicated, Levi's signature bold and confident, despite his inner uncertainty, Etta Mae's smaller and more careful, as if she were signing away more than just her maiden name. The Reverend added his own signature with a flourish and handed the certificate to Levi. Keep that safe, he advised. You'll need it for the county records when you get back home. Outside the church, Etta Mae's possessions consisted of a single battered carpet bag that had seen better days and a cloth bundle tied with string. Everything she owned in the world could be carried in one trip, which spoke to a life that had been spent moving from place to place without ever putting down roots. "Is this everything?" Levi asked, lifting the carpet bag. It was surprisingly light. "That's everything," she confirmed, her voice flat. Reverend Crenshaw emerged from the church behind them, moving slowly and pausing to catch his breath every few steps. His cough had gotten worse during the ceremony, and Levi could see the toll that his itinerant preaching was taking on his failing health. "Mr. Shaw, if I might have a word," the Reverend said quietly, gesturing for Levi to step aside. Etta Mae remained by the horses, one hand resting on Buck's neck as she studied the surrounding countryside with the calculating gaze of someone always looking for escape routes. "She's been through something terrible," Crenshaw said in a low voice. "I don't know what, and she won't say, but I can see it in her eyes. Be patient with her, Mr. Shaw. Give her time to trust you." "How much time?" Levi asked. "However long it takes. She's not like other girls her age. She's had to grow up too fast and too hard, but there's strength in her, and loyalty too, if you can earn it." Levi looked over at his new wife, seeing the way she held herself apart even in this moment that should have joined them together. "Any advice on how to earn it? Keep your word. Whatever you promise her, follow through. Don't make promises you can't keep, and don't try to push her into being something she's not ready to be." The Reverend's meaning was clear enough. This was a marriage in name only, at least for now, and Levi would have to respect that boundary until and unless Etta Mae decided otherwise. "I understand," Levi said. "I hope you do. I've seen too many arrangements like this go badly because the man thought marriage gave him the right to take what he wanted, willing or not." The words carried an implied threat that wasn't entirely clerical. Despite his failing health, Reverend Crenshaw had the bearing of a man who'd seen his share of trouble and wasn't afraid to intervene when necessary. "That won't be a problem," Levi assured him. "Good. Then I'll pray for both of you and hope that time will turn necessity into something warmer." The journey back to the ranch began in complete silence. Etta Mae rode behind Levi on Buck, her small hands gripping the cantle of the saddle rather than his waist, maintaining as much distance as possible despite their proximity. The carpet bag and bundle were tied securely behind her, everything she owned bouncing gently with the horse's steady gait. The first few miles passed through the same desolate country Levi had crossed on his way to Millfield, rolling prairie that stretched endlessly under a grey sky that threatened rain. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing mile, until it felt like a living thing riding alongside them. Finally, as they stopped to rest the horse beside a shallow creek, Etta Mae spoke for the first time since leaving the church. "What do I call you?" she asked, not looking at him as she dismounted. "Levi, I suppose. We're married now. And what do you want to call me?" He considered the question carefully. "What do you want to be called?" "Most people call me Etta Mae. Some call me Etta. Which do you prefer?" She was quiet for a moment, kneeling beside the creek to splash water on her face. "Nobody's ever asked me that before." "Well, I'm asking now. Etta Mae, then. It's what my mother called me." Before she trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Etta Mae it is." They let Buck drink from the creek while they shared jerky and hardtack in continued silence. Levi found himself stealing glances at his new wife, trying to reconcile the quiet, defensive young woman beside him with the sharp-tongued girl who'd interrogated him in the church. She ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning their surroundings. "How much farther?" she asked as they prepared to resume their journey. "About 6 hours if we keep a steady pace. We'll reach the ranch just before dark." She nodded and allowed him to help her mount Buck again, though she was careful not to let their hands touch longer than necessary. As they rode on through the afternoon, Levi found himself wondering what kind of life he'd committed himself to. What kind of home could two strangers build together? What kind of partnership could grow from such uncertain foundations? Behind him, Etta Mae Shaw sat straight-backed and silent, her new name still foreign on her tongue, and her future as uncertain as the weather brewing on the horizon ahead. The Shaw Ranch came into view just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Etta Mae felt her new husband's body tense slightly as they crested the hill that overlooked his valley, and she followed his gaze to see what had captured his attention. The homestead spread below them was both more and less than she'd expected. More because the cabin was larger and more solidly built than many she'd seen, with a wide front porch and glass windows that caught the last light of day. Less because everything about the place spoke of decline and neglect: sagging fence, lines, an unpainted barn with one door hanging askew, and far too few cattle scattered across pasture that could have supported many times their number. "Home," Levi said quietly, the single word carrying more weight than it should have. Etta Mae said nothing, but she felt something twist in her chest at the loneliness in his voice. This was a place that had once been loved. She could see that. Much. Someone had planted flowers along the porch, though they'd long since gone wild. Someone had hung a swing from the old oak tree beside the house, though one of the ropes had snapped and left it hanging crooked and useless. As they drew closer, she could see more details that spoke to the ranch's former prosperity. The barn was well constructed, built to last, but it needed paint and repairs. The fencing was good quality, but sections had been mended with whatever materials were at hand, rather than replaced properly. It was the home of a man who'd been making do for too long, patching problems rather than solving them. Buck picked his way carefully down the slope toward the cabin, his hooves finding secure footing among the loose stones. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that Levi had banked the fire carefully before leaving, and Etta Mae was grateful for the promise of warmth after the long, cold ride. They drew up beside the front porch, and Levi dismounted first before reaching up to help her down. She hesitated for a moment, looking at his outstretched hands, before placing her own in them and allowing him to lift her from the saddle. Her feet had barely touched the ground when she stepped quickly away, putting distance between them once again. "I'll see to Buck," Levi said, gathering the reins. "You go on inside and warm yourself by the fire. I'll bring your things in directly." Etta Mae climbed the 3 steps to the porch and paused at the front door, her hand on the latch. This was it then, the moment when she crossed the threshold into her new life, whatever that might hold. Behind her, she could hear Levi leading Buck toward the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The door opened easily under her hand, revealing a single large room that served as both kitchen and parlor. A stone fireplace dominated. On wall, with embers still glowing in the grate and a pile of split wood stacked neatly beside it. The furniture was simple but well made: a dining table and chairs, a rocking chair positioned to catch the fireplace's warmth, and shelves lined with books that suggested the previous occupant had been educated. What caught Etta Mae's attention immediately, however, was how obviously feminine touches remained throughout the room. Curtains hung at the windows in a pattern of yellow flowers that had faded with age, a quilted throw draped over the back of the rocking chair. Most telling of all, a coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would be back shortly. She moved through the room slowly, taking inventory of her new surroundings. The kitchen was well appointed, with a cast-iron stove, a pump for well water, and shelves lined with dishes and cooking supplies. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed was a sleeping loft above. Everything was clean and tidy, but it all felt frozen in time, as if the house had been waiting for its mistress to return. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a daguerreotype in a silver frame showed a younger Levi standing beside a woman, with kind eyes and dark hair arranged in an elaborate style. The woman wore a dress of light-colored fabric and was smiling at something beyond the camera's view. Sarah, Etta Mae realized. This was the first wife, the one whose ghost still seemed to inhabit every corner of the house. She was still studying the photograph when Levi entered, carrying her carpet bag and bundle. He set them down near the door and stood awkwardly in his own front room, as if he were the stranger here rather than she. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. "There's venison stew left from yesterday, and biscuits." "That would be fine," she replied, though she wasn't sure she could eat anything with her stomach tied in knots the way it was. As Levi moved around the kitchen, heating the stew and setting out plates, Etta Mae found herself drawn to a basket beside the rocking chair. Inside, she discovered a piece of needlework that had been left unfinished, a sampler with the words "Home Sweet Home," partially completed in careful cross-stitch, the needle still threaded with blue silk. She was working on that when she took sick, Levi said quietly, noticing where her attention had fallen. "Always said she'd finish it when she felt better." Etta Mae carefully folded the fabric and placed it back in the basket. "You've left everything just as it was. Seemed wrong to change things, like I'd be erasing her somehow." She understood that impulse, even if she'd never had anything permanent enough to preserve. But living in a shrine to another woman was going to be its own kind of challenge, especially when that woman had clearly been deeply loved. "Where will I sleep?" she asked, the practical question cutting through the emotional weight of the moment. Levi's cheeks colored slightly. "I thought you could take the loft. It's warm up there, and private. I'll sleep down here by the fire." The arrangement was exactly what she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. "That's very considerate. We're strangers, Etta Mae. I don't expect, that is, I won't assume." He trailed off, clearly struggling with the delicate nature of the subject. "I appreciate that," she said simply. They ate their supper in relative silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was good, rich and filling, and the biscuits were only slightly stale. Etta Mae found herself eating more than she'd expected, the warmth of the food spreading through her body and easing some of the tension she'd been carrying all day. "There's a trunk up in the loft," Levi said as they finished eating. "Sarah's things are in it, but there's room for yours as well. And there's a washstand with a basin and pitcher." "Thank you." After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Levi carried her belongings up the narrow stairs to the loft while she remained below, adding wood to the fire and trying to process the enormity of what had happened to her in the space of a single day. This morning she'd been Etta Mae Whitmore, a girl with no home and no prospects. Tonight she was Etta Mae Shaw, wife to a man she barely knew, mistress of a house that still belonged to a dead woman's memory. When Levi came back downstairs, he moved around the room preparing for the night, banking the fire, checking that. The door was properly latched, winding the clock that sat on the mantelpiece. The domestic routine was clearly well established, the habits of a man who'd been living alone for too long. "I usually rise before dawn," he said. "Ranch work starts early, but you don't need to get up with me. Sleep as long as you need to." "I'm used to early hours," she replied, "and if I'm to pull my weight, as you put it, I should know what needs doing." He nodded. "Well then, I suppose I'll say good night." "Good night, Levi." She climbed the stairs to the loft, her legs suddenly heavy with exhaustion. The space above was larger than she'd expected, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline, and a window that looked out over the valley. A narrow bed was positioned beneath the window, covered with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern that showed the skilled hand of its maker. The trunk Levi had mentioned sat at the foot of the bed, a sturdy piece of furniture that had probably come west in a wagon train decades earlier. Etta Mae approached it cautiously, as if it might contain something dangerous rather than the remnants of another woman's life. When she lifted the lid, the scent of lavender rose to greet her. Sachets tucked among carefully folded dresses and undergarments, all of them showing the quality and care of a woman who'd taken pride in her appearance. There was space for her own meager possessions, as Levi had promised, but adding her few items to the trunk felt like an intrusion, as if she were trespassing in sacred space. Still, she had nowhere else to put her things, so she made room among Sarah Shaw's belongings for her own worn dress and the few personal items she'd managed to keep through all her wanderings. At the bottom of her carpet bag, wrapped in an old piece of flannel, was the one thing of value she possessed, a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight before placing it carefully in the trunk beside Sarah's things. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window and reminding her of how isolated this place was, how far from anything resembling civilization. Below, she could hear Levi moving around, settling himself for the night on what must be a makeshift bed near the fireplace. As she undressed and pulled on her nightgown, Etta Mae caught sight of herself in a small mirror that hung on the wall. The face that looked back at her was thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many nights of poor sleep and too many days of uncertainty. But for the first time in months, perhaps years, she wasn't wondering where she'd sleep tomorrow night or where her next meal would come from. It wasn't love, and it wasn't home in any real sense of the word. But it was shelter, and it was safety, and for now, that would have to be enough. Etta Mae woke before dawn to the sound of Levi moving around downstairs, his boots creaking on the wooden floors as he prepared for the day's work. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of a household stirring to life. The rattle of the stove grate as he built up the fire, the splash of water being poured into a basin, the soft thud of the coffee pot being set on the stovetop. Through the small window beside her bed, she could see the first pale light of morning, beginning to touch the eastern horizon. The valley below was shrouded in mist that would burn off once the sun climbed higher, and she could make out the dark shapes of cattle scattered across the nearest pasture. By the time she dressed and made her way downstairs, Levi was already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a plate of fried eggs and bacon. He looked up as she descended the stairs, surprise evident on his face. "Didn't expect you to be up so early," he said, half rising from his chair. "There's coffee on the stove and I can fix you some breakfast." "I can manage for myself," she replied, moving toward the stove. "What needs doing today?" He settled back in his chair, studying her with those steady brown eyes. "Well, there's always fence that needs mending. Winter's hard on the wire, and cattle have a way of finding every weak spot. But you don't need to worry about ranch work. Right away, take time to settle in, figure out how you want to arrange things." Etta Mae poured herself coffee and cracked eggs into the skillet, the familiar rhythm of cooking calming her nerves. "I didn't marry you to sit idle, Levi. If this is going to work, I need to be useful." "All right, then." He finished his breakfast and carried his plate to the wash basin. "I was planning to ride out to the north pasture this morning, check on a section of fence line that's been giving me trouble. You could come along if you want to see more of the place." An hour later, they were mounted on horses, Levi on Buck, Etta Mae on a smaller bay mare named Rosie that had belonged to Sarah. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of a clear day ahead. As they rode through the valley, Levi pointed out landmarks and explained the layout of his property. "The creek runs year-round," he said, indicating the line of cottonwoods that marked the watercourse. "Never seen it go dry, even in the worst drought years. That's what made me choose this spot for the homestead." They passed through a gate that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, and Etta Mae dismounted to close it behind them, studying the mechanism and noting how the wooden post had begun to rot where it met the ground. "This needs replacing," she observed. "Along with about half the gates on the ranch," Levi agreed. "I've been making do with repairs for too long." The fence line they'd come to inspect ran along a ridge that offered a commanding view of the surrounding country. Much of the wire was intact, but several posts had been knocked down by falling trees during winter storms, leaving gaps that cattle could easily exploit. "I see the problem," Etta Mae said, dismounting and walking along the damaged section. She'd grown up on a farm before circumstances had forced her to leave, and she understood the basics of fence construction. "You'll need to reset these posts deeper. Ground's probably frozen now, but come spring thaw you could dig them proper." Levi watched her examine the fence with growing interest. "You know about ranch work?" "Some." My father had a small place back in Missouri before he died. Not cattle, but principles are the same. She didn't elaborate on what had happened after her father's death, but Levi didn't press. They spent the morning working together to make temporary repairs, splicing broken wire and propping up fallen posts with whatever materials they could find. It was honest work, the kind that left her hands dirty and her back aching, but gave her a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in months. "You're stronger than you look," Levi commented, as she helped him lift a heavy post into position. "Had to be. Weakness gets you killed out here, or worse." The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing more about her past than she'd intended. Levi's hand stilled on the post, and she felt his eyes on her face. "Etta Mae, we should head back," she said quickly, cutting off whatever question he'd been about to ask. "These repairs won't hold if the weather turns bad." The ride back to the cabin was quieter, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd shared the day before. This felt more like the comfortable quiet of two people who'd worked together toward a common goal, rather than the awkward tension of strangers forced into proximity. That afternoon, while Levi tended to other ranch duties, Etta Mae explored the house more thoroughly. She found Sarah's presence everywhere, in the carefully arranged dishes in the kitchen cupboards, in the books on the shelves that showed a taste for poetry and philosophy, in the garden behind the house where perennial flowers had been planted. With an eye for color and season, most telling of all, she found Sarah's apron hanging on a peg beside the kitchen stove, a simple garment of blue checked fabric that showed the wear of daily use. Without thinking, Etta Mae lifted it from the peg and held it against herself, noting how much larger it was than her own small frame would require. "She was taller than you." Etta Mae spun around to find Levi standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and an unreadable expression on his face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, moving to hang the apron back where she'd found it. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right." He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes moving from the apron to her face. "You'll need something to protect your clothes. While you're cooking, might as well use that one. Are you sure?" Sarah would have wanted it used rather than hanging there gathering dust. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the effort it cost him to say the words. She was practical about things like that. That evening, as they shared another quiet supper, Levi began to tell her more about the ranch's history and his plans for its future. The place had been in his family for nearly 15 years, built up slowly from a quarter-section claim to its current size through careful expansion and hard work. "Used to run near 200 head, he said. "Good money in beef cattle if you can get them to market in decent condition, but I've had to sell off most of the herd to keep up with expenses." "What about horses? This country seems good for horses." "Thought about it. There's a market for saddle stock, and the army's always looking for good mounts, but it takes capital to get started, and time to build a reputation." Etta Mae nodded, understanding the circular nature of his problem. He needed money to expand the operation, but he needed a larger operation to make money. It was the kind of trap that had caught many frontier families, forcing them to choose between gradual decline and risky gambles that might cost them everything. "What about chickens?" she asked. "Eggs, meat birds for special occasions. Not much startup cost, and they pay for themselves pretty quick. Used to keep chickens. Coyotes got most of them last winter, and I never got around to rebuilding the coop. I could do that, build a proper coop, get some laying hens from town, maybe some geese too. They're good for keeping predators away from the chickens." Levi looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "You've thought about this before." "I've thought about a lot of things. Most of them involved having a place to stay long enough to see them through." Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them both of winter's approach. But inside the small cabin, with the fire crackling in the grate and the lamp casting warm light over the kitchen table, something that felt almost like partnership was beginning to take root between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the foundation on which love might eventually be built, given time and patience and mutual respect. For now, That possibility was enough to keep them both working toward a future that neither could quite imagine but both desperately needed. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley with white while the aspen leaves were still clinging to their branches in shades of gold and amber. Etta Mae woke to find the world transformed outside her window, the familiar landscape, made strange and beautiful by winter's early arrival. Downstairs, she found Levi already dressed and pulling on his heavy coat. His face was grim as he looked out at the falling snow. "Cattle aren't ready for this," he said, by way of greeting. "Need to get them down to the winter pasture, closer to the barn where I can keep an eye on them." "I'll help," she said, moving toward the stove to start coffee. "It's hard work, Etta Mae, cold, wet, and the cattle won't want to cooperate." "I said I'll help." By the time they'd eaten breakfast and saddled the horses, the snow was falling more heavily, creating a curtain of white that limited visibility to a few hundred yards. Levi had loaded the saddlebags with rope and extra grain, preparing for a long day of moving reluctant cattle through increasingly difficult conditions. The work was every bit as hard as he'd warned. The cattle had scattered during the night, seeking shelter in draws and behind rock outcroppings, and each small group had to be found and persuaded to join the growing herd moving toward lower ground. Etta Mae's hands went numb despite her gloves, and ice formed in her horse's mane, but she stayed in the saddle and did her part. "You're a natural at this," Levi called to her as she expertly cut off a steer that was trying to break away from the group. "Where'd you learn to work cattle?" "Trial and error," she called back, but there was a note of pride in her voice that hadn't been there before. It was nearly dark by the time they had the last of the cattle settled in the winter pasture, and both of them were exhausted and soaked through despite their heavy coats. As they rode back to the cabin, Levi found himself stealing glances at his wife, seeing her in a new light. She'd worked without complaint through one of the most miserable days he could remember, proving herself as capable as any hired hand he'd ever known. That evening, as they sat by the fire drying their clothes and warming their hands around cups of hot coffee, the conversation turned more personal than it ever had before. "Tell me about Sarah," Etta Mae said quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "What was she like?" Levi was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "She was light," he said. "I know that sounds strange, but that's how I think of her, like she brought light into whatever room she entered. Always laughing, always finding something to be happy about, even when times were hard." "How did you meet her?" "Stagecoach. She was on her way to California to meet some relatives, and I was in town buying supplies. Coach broke an axle, and passengers had to stay over for repairs. We got to talking at the hotel restaurant, and—" he shrugged. "3 days later, I asked her to marry me." 3 days. Despite everything, Etta Mae found herself smiling. "And I thought our courtship was quick." She said yes because she could. "See this place the way it could be, not just the way it was." Said she could picture children playing in the yard, flowers blooming in the garden, cattle covering the hillsides. She had vision. "Did you want children?" "We both did. Tried for 8 years, but it never happened. Sarah said maybe it just wasn't meant to be, but I could see how it hurt her every time another month passed without—" He stopped, perhaps realizing that this was not a comfortable topic for his new wife. Etta Mae was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd shared. "Is that why you answered the advertisement? Looking for someone to give you the family you never had?" "Partly," he admitted. "But mostly I was just tired of being alone. Tired of talking to myself and hearing my own voice echo back from empty rooms." She understood that loneliness better than he knew. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Any thoughts of having children someday?" The question caught her off guard. Stirring emotions she'd buried deep. "I used to think about it. Before everything changed." What changed? This was dangerous territory, the conversation venturing towards subjects she'd sworn never to discuss with anyone. But sitting in the warm circle of firelight, with snow falling softly outside and this kind, lonely man beside her, The words came easier than they should have. I had a different life once. In Missouri, like I told you. My father had a small farm. Nothing grand, but it was ours. After he died, his brother inherited everything. Said a 16-year-old girl had no business trying to run a farm on her own. So you lost your home. I lost more than that. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My uncle, he had ideas about what a young woman under his roof should do to earn her keep. Ideas that didn't involve farming. Levi's hands tightened on his coffee cup, his jaw clenching as he understood her meaning. What did you do? I ran. Middle of the night, took what I could carry, and never looked back. She was surprised by how steady her voice remained. Been running ever since, one way or another. And now? Now I'm tired of running. Tired of looking over my shoulder and wondering if the next town will be safe, or just another place I'll have to leave in a hurry. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Levi reached under his chair and pulled out a small wooden object that had been carefully carved and sanded smooth. I made this a few years back, he said, holding it out to her, for a child that never came. Etta Mae took the carving carefully, turning it over in her hands. It was a small horse, no bigger than her palm, with flowing mane and tail and legs positioned as if it were galloping across an open field. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing hours of patient work and genuine artistic skill. It's beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. You're very talented. Sarah always said I should make more of them, maybe sell them in town, but it seemed wrong somehow to make toys for other people's children when we couldn't have our own. Maybe you could teach me to carve. I've always been good with my hands, but I've never tried anything like this. The offer seemed to surprise him. You'd want to learn? I'd like to try. It seems like the kind of skill that might be useful out here, especially during the long winter evenings. I'd be glad to teach you, he said, and she could hear the genuine pleasure in his voice. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the snow against the windows with increasing force. But inside the cabin, something warmer than the fire was growing. Between them, not love, not yet, but understanding, recognition of shared losses and shared hopes, the foundation of something that might eventually become deeper. Levi, she said softly, still holding the carved horse. Thank you for not pushing, for giving me time to get used to all this. We've got time, Etta Mae, all the time in the world. As they prepared for bed that night, banking the fire and checking the doors against the storm, Etta Mae found herself thinking about the wooden horse and what it represented. Dreams deferred, but not abandoned. Hope that had survived disappointment and loss. The possibility that broken people might find ways to heal each other, given patience and kindness. And time. Upstairs in the loft, she placed the little horse on the windowsill, where it could catch the morning light. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white, and promising that winter would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Etta Mae felt like she might be strong enough to meet whatever challenges lay ahead, not alone this time, but as part of something larger than herself. A partnership that was slowly, carefully, beginning to feel like it might become a home. 3 weeks after the first snow, just as Etta Mae was beginning to believe she might have found a safe harbor at last, her past came calling in the form of a hard-faced stranger on a tired horse. She was in the barn, tending to the small flock of chickens she'd convinced Levi to buy from a neighbor, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Through the barn door, she could see a lone rider silhouetted against the gray November sky, his long coat flapping in the wind as he urged his mount up the slope toward the house. Something about the way he sat his horse, the purposeful nature of his approach, sent ice through her veins. This was not a neighbor come calling or a traveler seeking shelter from the cold. This was someone with business to conduct, and in her experience, that kind of business rarely ended well for people like her. Levi emerged from the cabin to greet the visitor, and Etta Mae crept closer to the barn door to listen. The strangers. Her voice carried clearly in the still air, flat and professional in a way that made her blood run cold. "You Levi Shaw?" "I am. What can I do for you?" "Name's Garrett. I'm a federal marshal and I'm looking for someone." The man dismounted and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Girl goes by the name of Etta Mae Whitmore. About 17, dark hair, small build. You seen anyone matching that description?" Etta Mae's world tilted on its axis. She pressed herself against the barn wall, her heart hammering so hard she was sure it could be heard across the yard. Marshal. Federal marshal. Which meant this wasn't about her uncle or anything that had happened in Missouri. This was something bigger, something that could see her hanged. "Can't say that I have," Levi replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Mind telling me what she's wanted for?" Garrett unfolded the paper, and even from her hiding place, Etta Mae could see it was a wanted poster with her face sketched in black ink. Bank robbery in Kansas. 3 men and a girl, matching her description, hit the Farmers Trust in Dodge City 2 months ago. Got away with nearly $4,000. That's a serious charge. Serious enough. One of the tellers was shot during the robbery. He died 3 days later. Garrett refolded the poster and tucked it back into his coat. Makes it a hanging offense. Etta Mae closed her eyes, fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She remembered Dodge City, remembered the 3 men who'd forced her to hold their horses while they robbed the bank. She'd been running from her uncle's farm, desperate and alone, when they'd found her on the road and decided she'd make useful cover for their crimes. A young girl waiting with horses outside a bank drew less attention than 3 men would have. She'd tried to run when the shooting started, but they'd caught her and threatened to kill her if she didn't keep quiet. For 2 days, they'd kept her with them, using her as a shield whenever they encountered law enforcement, before finally abandoning her when they crossed into Colorado Territory. She'd never seen a penny of the stolen money, had never even entered the bank. But she knew her. Word against theirs would mean nothing to a judge. "I'll keep an eye out," Levi was saying. "You planning to stay in the area long?" "Few more days, maybe. Check the surrounding ranches, ask questions in town. Girl like that needs food and shelter. Someone's seen her." "Well, if I hear anything, I'll be sure to let you know." "Appreciated. Oh, and Shaw, there's a $500 reward for information leading to her capture, dead or alive." Etta Mae heard the marshal mount his horse and ride away, but she remained frozen against the barn wall for several minutes, her mind racing. $500. More money than the ranch was likely to see in a year. More than enough to pay off the mortgage and buy the cattle Levi needed to make the operation profitable again. When she finally forced herself to move, she found Levi standing in the barn doorway, his face grave and his eyes filled with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Long enough." He stepped into the barn and closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold wind and creating a space that felt suddenly intimate and dangerous. "Etta Mae Whitmore, that your real name?" "It's the name I was born with." Her voice sounded strange, to her own ears, distant and hollow. "And the bank robbery? You want to tell me about that?" She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who'd given her shelter and safety, who'd treated her with kindness and respect when he had no reason to do either. The man whose ranch was failing, whose dreams were dying a little more each. And day as the debts mounted and the cattle dwindled. "You could turn me in," she said quietly. $500 would solve a lot of your problems." "That's not what I asked." She moved to the pile of hay bales in the corner and sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. "I didn't rob that bank, Levi, but I was there, and a man died, and in the eyes of the law that makes me just as guilty as the ones who pulled the trigger. Tell me what happened." So she told him everything, about running from her uncle's farm, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few dollars she'd managed to save. About the 3 men who'd found her on the road outside Dodge City, hungry and desperate and easy prey for anyone with cruel intentions. about how they'd forced her to be their accomplice, threatening to kill her if she refused, and promising to abandon her in the wilderness if she tried to escape. "I held their horses," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I did. But when that teller tried to fight back and they shot him, I became part of it. In the eyes of the law, I'm a killer." Levi was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on her face as if he were trying to see into her soul. "What happened to the men who really did it?" "I don't know. They left me behind when they crossed into Colorado. Said I was slowing them down. I've been running ever since, trying to stay ahead of the law and anyone else who might recognize me from those wanted posters." And now she looked up at him, seeing the conflict in his expression. This was a good man, an honest man, and she was asking him to harbor a fugitive. Even if he believed her story, even if he understood that she was more victim than criminal, the law was the law. "Now I run again," she said. "Tonight, probably, before that marshal comes back with more questions." "Where will you go?" "West, maybe. California. Or north to Canada. Somewhere far enough away that they'll stop looking eventually. And leave me to explain where my wife disappeared to." The question caught her off guard. In all her planning and panicking, she hadn't thought about how her disappearance would affect him. "You could say I left you, that the marriage didn't work out, and I went back east to my family." "Could say that," he agreed, "but I won't have to, because you're not leaving." She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Levi, you don't understand. I'm wanted for murder. If they find me here, then we'll deal with it when the time comes. You could lose everything. The ranch, your freedom, maybe your life if they think you were helping me." "I could." He sat down beside her on the hay bales, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "But I won't lose the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years. I'm not worth that risk. That's not your decision to make." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the wind rattle the barn doors and the soft sounds of the chickens settling for the night. Finally, Etta Mae found her voice again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because you're my wife. Because in the past few weeks you've given me more hope for the future than I've had since Sarah died. Because I believe your story and I believe in you." He turned to face her fully. "And because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. The marshal will be back. He'll ask more questions, look more closely. What? If he recognizes me? Then we'll figure out how to prove your innocence. And if we can't, then we'll deal with that too." Outside, the wind was picking up, driving the promise of another storm toward their valley. But inside the barn, with Levi's steady presence beside her and his quiet words of support still echoing in her ears, Etta Mae felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, built on the kindness of a man who had every reason to protect himself rather than her. But it was real, and for the first time since hearing the marshal's voice in the yard, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to run again. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I haven't told you." "What's that?" "My real name isn't Etta Mae Whitmore. It's Etta Mae Sullivan. Whitmore was my mother's maiden name. I started using it after I ran from my uncle's place, thought it might help throw anyone off my trail." "Etta Mae Sullivan," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I like it. Has a nice ring to it. Levi Shaw and Etta Mae Sullivan. Sounds like a couple who might actually have a future together, doesn't it?" "It does," he agreed. "It really does." But even as they spoke of the future, both of them knew that the past wasn't finished with them yet. Somewhere out there, Marshal Garrett was asking questions and showing wanted posters, getting closer to the truth with each conversation. And when he found it, all their hopes and dreams might crumble to dust. For now, though, they had each other. And they had the choice to stand together against whatever storm was coming. It would have to be enough. The next 3 days passed like a slow-motion nightmare, every sound outside the cabin making Etta Mae's heart race, and every rider on the horizon a potential threat. Levi had moved his father's old hunting rifle from above the fireplace to a more accessible spot beside the kitchen door, and she'd caught him checking and rechecking the ammunition more than once. "We need a plan," he said on the third morning, as they sat over coffee that neither of them was really drinking. "Can't. Just wait for him to come back and hope for the best." Etta Mae nodded, though the idea of planning anything beyond her next breath felt overwhelming. "What kind of plan?" "First thing is to find out exactly what evidence they have against you. If it's just the word of those 3 men, that's one thing. If there are witnesses who can identify you specifically, that's another. How do we find that out? I could ride into town, ask some careful questions, maybe send a telegram to the sheriff in Dodge City, see what details he's willing to share with a concerned citizen." The idea of him leaving her alone, even for a few hours, made her stomach clench with anxiety. What if the marshal comes back while you're gone? Then you hide in the root cellar until he leaves. There's no law that says you have to answer the door. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing Garrett without Levi's steady presence beside her was terrifying. And what if he doesn't believe I'm not here? What if he searches the place? He'd need a warrant for that. And he doesn't have one. Not yet, anyway. Levi reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. "We'll get through this, Etta Mae. Together." She wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her that hope was a dangerous luxury for people like her. Still, the warmth of his hand on hers was real, and for now that had to be enough. That afternoon, while Levi was in the barn tending to the horses, Etta Mae heard the sound she'd been dreading, hoofbeats approaching the cabin. But when she looked out the window, it wasn't Marshal Garrett she saw riding up the slope. It was their nearest neighbor, Martha Henley, a woman in her 50s who lived with her husband on a small homestead about 5 miles to the east. Etta Mae had met Martha only once before, at Henderson's trading post, where the older woman had been polite but distant. Now she dismounted from her horse and approached the cabin with the purposeful stride of someone who had business to conduct. "Mrs. Shaw," Martha called, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Etta Mae opened the door cautiously, her mind racing through possible reasons for this unexpected visit. "Mrs. Henley, please, come in out of the cold." Martha stepped inside and removed her heavy coat, her eyes taking in the details of the cabin with the frank curiosity of a frontier woman. "Thank you. I hope you don't mind me calling without invitation, but I felt it was important that we speak." "Of course. Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be appreciated." As Etta Mae busied herself with the coffee pot, Martha settled herself at the kitchen table and fixed her with a steady gaze. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here." The thought had crossed my mind. "There's been a federal marshal asking questions around the area. About a young woman, about your age and general description I thought you should know." Etta Mae's hand trembled slightly as she poured the coffee, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "What sort of questions?" "The kind that suggest someone's in trouble. The kind that get people talking and speculating, which is rarely good for anyone involved." Martha accepted the cup Etta Mae offered her and took a careful sip. "I also thought you should know that not everyone in this valley is eager to help federal marshals with their inquiries." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Etta Mae wasn't sure she understood. "I'm not sure I follow. Let me be plain then. My husband and I came west to get away from government interference in our lives. We've seen what happens when federal agents start poking around in people's business, and we don't care for it." Martha set down her cup and leaned forward. "Whatever trouble you might be in, Mrs. Shaw, it's none of their concern unless you make it their concern." Etta Mae felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by this unexpected show of support from a woman who barely knew her. "Mrs. Henley, you don't need to say anything, but you should know that if anyone comes asking us about you, our answer will be that you're a good neighbor and a good wife to Levi Shaw, and that's all we know or care to know." Just then, Levi's boots sounded on the porch, and he entered the cabin with a nod of greeting to their visitor. "Martha, good to see you." Levi, I was just telling your wife that there's been a federal marshal nosing around the area. So, I've heard. His voice was carefully neutral. Anything we should be concerned about? Not from us, or from most of the other folks around here, but I thought you should know that Bill Henderson was asking pointed questions about your marriage, about where Mrs. Shaw came from and such. Levi's jaw tightened. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he might be willing to earn himself a reward by providing information to the right people. Etta Mae felt the blood drain from her face. Henderson had been present for several of her conversations with Levi, had seen her, reading the marriage advertisement, had probably put together more pieces of the puzzle than anyone else in the area. I see, Levi said quietly. Well, I appreciate you letting us know. Martha rose from the table and pulled on her coat. There's something else. My husband's brother lives down in Kansas near Dodge City. He sent us a letter a few weeks back, mentioned that bank robbery everyone's been talking about, said the descriptions of the men involved didn't match what the law was saying. Etta Mae's heart began to race. What do you mean? According to what he heard from folks who were actually there, the girl with those robbers was older than they're claiming. Early 20s maybe, with light hair. And she was the one giving orders, not just holding horses. The information hit Etta Mae like a physical blow. If there were witnesses who could contradict the official description, if there was evidence that she wasn't the person they were looking for, would your brother-in-law be willing to swear to that in court? Levi asked. I expect he would if it came to that. He's not fond of seeing innocent people railroaded by lazy law enforcement. After Martha left, Etta Mae and Levi sat at the kitchen table, trying to process what they'd learned. The possibility that she might be able to prove her innocence was intoxicating, but it also meant taking enormous risks. We need to contact this brother-in-law, Levi said. Get a sworn statement about what he witnessed. And how do we do that? Without revealing where I am? Carefully. Maybe through Martha or through a lawyer in Cheyenne who can handle things discreetly. Etta Mae nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to the practical problems they faced. What about Henderson? If he's already suspicious, how long before he puts the pieces together? Not long, probably, which means we need to move fast. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their last night of relative peace, Levi pulled the hunting rifle down from its new resting place and began cleaning it with methodical precision. The weapon was old but well-maintained, a lever action, Winchester that had belonged to his father and seen service in the Indian Wars. You know how to use one of these? He asked, noting her interest in the rifle. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said a woman living on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. Good, because if things go badly, I might need you to cover my back. The casual way he said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a husband to expect his wife to stand and fight beside him, brought tears to her eyes. In all her years of running and hiding, no one had ever offered to stand with her against the forces that pursued her. Levi, she said softly, if this goes wrong, if they take me, they won't. But if they do, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best of my life, that for the first time since I was a child, I felt like I belonged somewhere. He set down the rifle and turned to face her fully. You do belong somewhere. You belong here with me, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from us. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving clouds across the face of the moon, and promising another storm by morning. But inside the cabin, with the fire crackling in the grate and Levi's steady presence beside her, Etta Mae felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt like she was home. Whatever came next, whatever price they had to pay for the chance to build a life together, she was ready to face it. Not alone this time, but as part of something larger and stronger than either of them could be on their own. As they banked the fire and prepared for bed, both of them knew that tomorrow would likely bring the confrontation they'd been dreading. Marshal Garrett would return, probably with more questions and possibly with a warrant. The game of cat and mouse they'd been playing was almost over, but tonight they were together. Tonight they were husband and wife, partners facing an uncertain future with nothing but their faith in each other to sustain them. It would have to be enough, because in the morning they would find out whether love and loyalty were stronger than the law, whether two people fighting for their future could overcome a past that refused to stay buried. The reckoning was coming, and they would meet it together. Marshal Garrett arrived just after dawn, but he didn't come alone. Etta Mae spotted them first through the loft window, 3 riders cresting the hill that overlooked the valley, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their quarry had nowhere to run. Beside Garrett rode a man she recognized with a sick twist in her stomach, Bill Henderson, his face grim with the satisfaction of a man about to collect a substantial reward. The third rider was unfamiliar, a younger man wearing a deputy's badge that caught the early morning light as he urged his horse down the slope toward the cabin. "Levi," she called softly down the stairs. "They're here." He appeared at the bottom of the staircase, the Winchester already in his hands and his face set, in hard lines she'd never seen before. "How many?" "3. Garrett, Henderson, and a deputy." "All right." His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in the way he held his shoulders. "You remember what we talked about?" She nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she could barely think. They'd rehearsed this moment, planned for it, but now that it was here, everything felt surreal and impossible. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the riders approached the cabin. Etta Mae climbed down from the loft and took her position beside the kitchen window, where she could see the yard but remain hidden from view. Levi moved to the door, the rifle held casually at his side but ready to be brought to bear in an instant. "Shaw!" Garrett's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Federal Marshal, need to have a word with you." Levi opened the door, but remained on the threshold, his body blocking any view into the cabin's interior. "Marshal, back again so soon?" "Got some new information that changes things." Garrett dismounted and approached the porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "Mr. Henderson here has been telling me some interesting stories about your recent marriage." Henderson climbed down from his horse with obvious discomfort, his arthritic joints protesting the long ride. But his eyes were bright with anticipation as he looked toward the cabin. "Told him about that girl you married, Shaw. Real quick courtship, wasn't it? Almost like she was in a hurry to find somewhere to hide." "My wife and I met through proper channels," Levi replied evenly. "Nothing unusual about that." "Maybe not," Garrett said, pulling the folded wanted poster from his coat. "But it sure is unusual for a man to marry someone without asking her real name first." The deputy had remained mounted, his rifle across his saddle, and his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area. Professional and alert, Etta Mae realized. This wasn't going to be as simple as they'd hoped. "I know my wife's name," Levi said. "Do you? Because according to Mr. Henderson here, the name on your marriage certificate doesn't match the name this young lady was using when she first came to town." Garrett unfolded the poster and held it up where Levi could see it clearly. "Etta Mae Whitmore, wanted for bank robbery and murder in Kansas. Ring any bells?" From her position by the window, Etta Mae could see the tension spreading through Levi's frame, like a wire being drawn tight. This was the moment they'd both known would come, when he would have to choose between his safety and hers. "Can't say that it does," he replied. "Really? Because Mr. Henderson remembers you reading a marriage advertisement in his store for several days running, remembers you talking about answering it, and he remembers a young woman matching this description traveling through town right around the time you went to meet your bride." Henderson stepped forward, his voice carrying the self-righteousness of a man convinced he was doing his civic duty. "Saw her with my own eyes, Marshal. Same girl as in that picture, no doubt about it." "Where is she now, Shaw?" Garrett's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Where's your wife?" "Visiting neighbors," Levi said calmly. "The Henley place. Won't be back until this evening." "Convenient." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You won't mind if we take a look around then? Just to satisfy ourselves that you're telling the truth." "Actually, I would mind. This is my property, and you're not welcome here without a warrant." "Warrant's being drawn up as we speak." Should be here by noon, Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Of course, if you're harboring a wanted fugitive, that makes you an accessory after the fact. Federal crime. Could see you hanged right alongside her. The words hung in the air like a physical threat, and Etta Mae saw Levi's grip tighten on the rifle. Everything they'd built together, every hope they'd shared, was balanced on the edge of this moment. That would be a problem, Levi said quietly, if I was harboring anyone. But since I'm not, I guess we'll just have to wait for your warrant. Or, Henderson interjected, we could settle this right now. $500 is a lot of money, Shaw. More than your ranch is worth, from what I hear. Turn her over. And you could pay off your debts and start fresh somewhere else. The offer hung between them like a serpent, tempting and poisonous. $500, enough to save the ranch, to secure his future, to buy his way out of the trap that poverty and isolation had built around him. Etta Mae held her breath, waiting for his answer, knowing that whatever he said in the next few seconds would determine the course of both their lives. Levi looked at Henderson for a long moment, his face expressionless. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying across the yard with the finality of a judge's gavel. I appreciate the offer, Henderson, but I'm not in the habit of selling my wife to the highest bidder. The words hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Henderson's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, while Garrett's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. So you admit she's here, the marshal said. I admit she's my wife, legally married with witnesses and documentation. What she may or may not have done before that marriage is between her and God. The law doesn't recognize marriage as a shield for murder, Shaw. And I don't recognize the law's right to condemn someone without a fair trial. From her hiding place, Etta Mae felt pride and terror warring in her chest. Levi was standing up for her, protecting her, but he was also signing his own death warrant in the process. She couldn't let him sacrifice himself for her sake. Before she could lose her nerve, she stepped away from the window and moved toward the door. It's all right, Levi. I'll come out. Etta Mae. No, but she was already pushing past him onto the porch, her hands visible and empty, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear coursing through her veins. Marshal Garrett, I believe you're looking for me. The marshal's hand went immediately to his weapon, though he didn't draw it. The deputy raised his rifle, and Henderson stepped quickly back, suddenly eager to put distance between himself and the wanted fugitive he'd helped track down. Etta Mae Whitmore, Garrett said, satisfaction evident in his voice. You're under arrest for the robbery of the Farmers Trust Bank in Dodge City, Kansas, and for the murder of Clarence Hartwell. My name is Etta Mae Shaw, she corrected quietly. And I didn't murder anyone. That's for a judge and jury to decide. Garrett began moving toward the porch, his hand still resting on his gun. You'll come with us peacefully, or we'll take you by force. Your choice. Actually, a new voice interrupted. There's a third choice. Everyone turned to see Martha Henley riding into the yard, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came her husband, Tom, along with 3 other neighbors Etta Mae recognized from town. All of them were armed, and all of them looked grimly determined. Mrs. Henley, Garrett said carefully, suddenly aware that the odds had shifted against him. This is federal business. I'd advise you not to interfere. Wouldn't dream of it, Martha replied, dismounting and walking toward the group with the steady confidence of a woman who'd faced down hostile Indians and survived blizzards that killed grown men. Just came to deliver some information that might be relevant to your investigation. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded telegram, holding it up where everyone could see it. Just received this from my brother-in-law in Dodge City. He was there the day of the robbery, saw the whole thing. Garrett's eyes narrowed. What's it say? Says the girl who was with those robbers was blonde, not brunette. Says she was older than the wanted posters claim, maybe 25 or so. And says she was the one giving orders, not just holding horses. Martha's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. Also says the real robbers were caught 3 days ago trying to hit another bank in Missouri. All confessed to the Dodge City job when they were faced with the evidence. The silence that followed was so complete that Etta Mae could hear her own heartbeat. Garrett's face had gone pale, and she could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes for the first time. "That telegram could be a fake," Henderson protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be," Tom Henley agreed, speaking for the first time. "But I doubt Judge Morrison in Cheyenne would think so, especially since we also got a telegram from the sheriff in Dodge City confirming that the charges against Etta Mae Whitmore have been dropped due to new evidence." Martha pulled a second telegram from her coat and handed it directly to Marshal Garrett. "Care to read it yourself?" Garrett unfolded the paper with hands that weren't quite steady, his eyes scanning the text quickly. As he read, his face went from pale to ashen, and Etta Mae saw his shoulders sag slightly in defeat. "Well?" the deputy asked impatiently. "Charges have been dropped," Garrett said quietly. "Real perpetrators are in custody. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Shaw, has been cleared of all wrongdoing." The words hit Etta Mae like a physical force, and she felt her knees go weak with relief. Levi's arm came around her waist, supporting her, and she leaned into his strength as the reality of her freedom began to sink in. "Seems like you made this trip for nothing, Marshal," Tom Henley observed. "Seems like," Garrett agreed. He refolded the telegram and handed it back to Martha, his professional demeanor intact despite his obvious embarrassment. "Mrs. Shaw, I apologize for the trouble. You're free to go." "She was already free," Levi said pointedly. "Free and legally married to me, free and living on my land under my protection." Henderson, who had been growing more uncomfortable by the minute, suddenly found his voice again. "Now wait just a minute. I was acting on good information. How was I supposed to know? You were acting on greed." Martha cut him off sharply. $500 looked pretty good to you, didn't it, Bill? Good enough to turn on your neighbors. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Henderson's face burned with shame and anger. But there was nothing he could say in his own defense, nothing that would restore the respect he'd lost in the eyes of his community. As the group began to disperse, the immediate crisis over, Etta Mae felt the last of her strength leave her. She sagged against Levi's side, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. She was free. After months of running, after years of fear, she was finally truly free, and more than that, she was home. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that painted the valley in shades of green and gold, Etta Mae stood on the front porch of the cabin watching Levi work with the new foals in the corral. The sight still filled her with quiet amazement. Not just the healthy horses that represented the ranch's growing prosperity, but the easy confidence in her husband's movements, the way he'd grown into the role of a man with something worth protecting. The sound of wagon wheels on the road drew her attention, and she smiled when she recognized the Henley family approaching for the celebration they'd planned. Martha had insisted on organizing a proper wedding reception, claiming that the hasty ceremony in the abandoned church hadn't given the community a proper chance to welcome the new Mrs. Shaw. Behind the Henleys came 2 more wagons filled with neighbors who had become genuine friends over the winter months. People who had seen Etta Mae and Levi work together through the hardest season either of them had ever faced, who had watched their marriage of convenience slowly transform into something deeper and more enduring. "Looks like Martha brought half." "The county," Levi said, walking up from the corral and slipping his arms around her waist from behind. The gesture was natural now, comfortable in a way that would have been impossible during those first awkward weeks. "She said she wanted to do this right," Etta Mae replied, leaning back against his chest and feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I think she's making up for all the wedding celebrations she missed during the Indian Wars." They watched as their guests began unloading covered dishes and musical instruments, transforming the ranch yard into an impromptu festival ground. Children ran between the wagons, their laughter bright in the morning air, while the men gathered around the corral to admire the horses and discuss the coming roundup. Regrets, Levi asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. It was a question he'd asked several times over the winter, usually in quiet moments when they were alone together. She understood why. Their marriage had begun as a desperate bargain between strangers, and he wanted to be sure that what it had become was what she truly wanted. "None," she said firmly, turning in his arms to face him. "Not a single one." The truth of that statement still amazed her sometimes. She'd found love in the last place she'd expected it, with a man who had asked nothing of her except honesty and partnership. They'd built something together that was stronger than either of them had been alone, something that had survived the test of her dangerous past and emerged even more solid. "Good," he said, and kissed her forehead gently, "because I have something for you." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, she found a simple gold band, newly forged by the blacksmith in town. It was nothing fancy, but it was hers, not borrowed or inherited, but made specifically for her hand. "We never did have proper rings," Levi explained, sliding the band onto her finger with careful reverence. "Seemed like it was time to remedy that." Etta Mae looked down at the ring, feeling its unfamiliar weight against her skin. It matched the one Levi now wore, simple gold bands that declared their commitment to the world without ostentation or pretense. "It's perfect," she whispered. The celebration that followed was everything Martha had promised and more. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by generous neighbors. Musicians played fiddles and harmonicas late into the evening, and couples danced under the stars while children chased fireflies around the yard. But for Etta Mae, the most meaningful part of the day came when Reverend Walsh, a circuit preacher who had arrived just that morning, asked if they'd like to renew their vows before the assembled company. This time, when they spoke the ancient words of commitment, they meant them with their whole hearts. This time, when Levi promised to love and cherish her, she believed him completely. And this time, when she promised to stand by him through whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she had the strength to keep that promise. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Walsh declared to the cheering crowd. Again, as the laughter and applause died down, Levi took her hand and led her away from the celebration, up the hill behind the cabin to a spot that offered a view of the entire valley. Below them, lanterns twinkled in the gathering dusk, and the sound of music drifted up on the warm evening air. "Look there," he said, pointing toward the eastern pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully in the moonlight. 40 head now, with more coming in the fall. And those horses are already attracting buyers from as far away as Denver. "The ranch is thriving," she agreed. "You should be proud." "We should be proud," he corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you." She knew he was right. The chicken coop she'd built had provided steady income through the winter months, and her skill with the vegetable garden had saved the money they'd been able to invest in livestock. More than that, her partnership had given him the confidence to take risks, to dream bigger than mere survival. "What do you see when you look at this place now?" Levi asked. Etta Mae studied the valley spread out below them, seeing it not as it was, but as it could be. "I see a home," she said simply. "I see children playing in that yard someday, maybe. I see Christmas mornings and harvest celebrations and all the ordinary days in between that make a life worth living." "Children," he repeated thoughtfully. "You'd want that? With you?" "Yes, very much." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors prepare to depart, listening to the final songs of the evening carried on the night breeze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did on a working ranch, but they would face them together as partners in every sense of the word. "Do you remember what I told you that first day?" Levi asked as they finally turned to walk back down the hill. "About how sometimes the best things in life start with the worst circumstances?" "I remember. I was right about that, wasn't I?" Etta Mae looked back at the cabin that had become her home, at the valley that had welcomed her, at the man who had given her not just shelter, but love. Yes, she said, squeezing his hand. You were absolutely right. In the distance, the last wagon was pulling away from the ranch, its lantern bobbing like a firefly in the darkness. Soon the valley would be quiet again, empty except for the sound of cattle settling for the night and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. But it would never be empty of hope again. Love had taken root in this hard country, growing strong in the most unlikely soil, proving that sometimes the most desperate bargains could become the most precious gifts. And in the morning, they would wake up together and begin building their future, one day at a time, with all the patience and determination that had brought them this far, together.